You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
The strategies of the left. Welcome everyone to PolyPat. PolyPat is back, and we're taking a little break from our scripture studies today to talk about something highly relevant in America and throughout the world, really, which is strategies of the left, of liberal regimes, you could say, because it's very important to become aware of what's going on and like how things are playing out. You know, St. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 2 that we're not ignorant of the designs of the evil one, and we're not supposed to be ignorant. But we're supposed to actually know, like, hey, here's how the principalities and powers are working through certain systems, and here's what's coming, so that we can know how best to fight and how best to spread the gospel in the midst of you know, a takeover, basically. And so, Pat, you are very much great at philosophy and at politics and political philosophy. And we've had so many off the air conversations about politics and what's going on with Trump and Biden and like all of these things now with this new administration that we were like, you know, we should record an episode where we just talk about and kind of go point by point through strategies of the left, right, so that people can be aware of like what they're consuming with the media and like how things are playing out. And because the more aware we are, the better we can be equipped, like I said, to spread the gospel and to not get duped by any of the lies that are floating out there. So,
right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Welcome, Pat. And what initial comments do you have about all of this?
Well, the first comment is I actually don't like focusing on politics too much. Now, politics, right, you know, it's the affairs of men. So it's something that we're naturally inclined toward. We are social, political animals, so we'll always be engaged in politics. I just really like talking, you know, metaphysics and theology so much more. And maybe that's because I'm always so annoyed about what's going on politically that it's just, and I hate to always be, you know, a downer. So I have to say, I you know, I'm not somebody who's inclined to want to have these types of conversations, but I think they're necessary. I think they can't be ignored, and I think we need to show that we have to be willing to have these types of conversations, because one of the tactics of the left is control through silencing, bullying, censorship, and intimidation. So if nothing else, we need to show that conversation can and will be had, and that we will not accept the intimidation tactics of the left. So that's why we're here, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes.
And when this episode gets taken down from all the media sources, you'll know that we spoke the truth.
Right. You know, maybe we should just start, because, you know, I'm going to, you know, rail into the left a fair amount this episode, as probably has already been hinted at. But, you know, maybe just a few words about President Trump and political thinking in general. I think it's enormously important, especially for Catholics, that our allegiance, our affiliation, our identity is with and in Christ. And as Catholics, that we follow the rule and the guidance of the church. And that's it. That's it. And we use those principles, the principles of revelation, the guidance of the magisterium, to reflect on various political situations, to evaluate various political parties and candidates as fairly and as honestly as we can. And it's never cut and dry. We never, at least in America, at least not these days, find any candidate who perfectly corresponds to church teaching that is also a viable candidate, right? That actually has a chance in any sense. It's almost always, you know, a weighing of you know, pros and cons of lesser and greater evils, and, you know, of acting not just with our conscience, but under the obligation to have a well-formed conscience. That's one of the problems of political discourse these days. Is people say, "Well, I'm doing something in you know, with good conscience." Okay, but it also needs to be a well-formed conscience. That's one of our moral obligations, is to form our conscience in accordance with the teachings of the church, which can also be borne out philosophically through an understanding of the natural law. Now, why do I bring this up? Is because I see very often, and this is certainly true in America, I can't speak for other cultures because I don't spend time there, where people put greater allegiance in political parties, affiliations, and candidates than they do to the Catholic Church. And this is true of Catholics for sure. So, I voted for Trump in 2016. I voted for him in 2020. He was far better than Hillary, but he wasn't a perfect candidate. And so before I start going off on the left, if I were to just kind of like grade Trump on where I think he did a good job, I think he did a great job with judge appointments, pro-life conservative judge appointments, the Supreme Court. That was a big win. He did a great job with pro-life initiatives, with promoting a pro-life culture. That was a huge thing that I was very happy to have with Trump. Obviously, he did really help the economy to grow and expand, which is nice. He secured historic peace deals. He started no new foreign wars. These are not insignificant accomplishments, and these are accomplishments that I would argue everybody should recognize as positive things, regardless of what else you think about Trump. I'm not sure.
And we have to keep in mind that when Trump did get elected the first time, everyone thought World War III was going to break out and that he would be a warmonger. But actually, he had these peace treaties that there was no foreign war during his presidency.
No, and that is so, that's one of the things I always liked about kind of more of the left, is they seem to be more anti-war. And I would argue a lot of a lot of what goes on in these foreign wars does not fit the criteria of a just war at all. So I am quite, anti starting new foreign wars, right? So that's something where I would normally side more with the left, or be more inclined towards the left. And that was why I was very inclined towards many libertarian thinkers who were very, against a lot of this, what seemed unjustified, often mass killings, right? Just horrible things that would go on that would hardly ever be reported by the mainstream media, and still aren't in many respects. Interestingly enough. So yeah, that's something where Trump defied the mainstream predictions, as he consistently defied mainstream predictions in many respects. He defied them economically. He defied them in terms of peace deals, of not starting new wars. People thought he was just going to launch nuclear bombs all over the place. All that, of course, was completely false and was not true. Where did he fail for me? Well, I think a number of his, immigration policies were draconian. I don't think that they were necessary. Does that mean that I'm not for some type of sound, sensible immigration policy? No, I think countries need to have an obligation to protect their citizens, just like I, as the head of my household, have an obligation to protect my family. And that's a more binding obligation that I have before I just start, letting anybody into my house. But of course, I still have an obligation to help other people too. But just as I have proximate obligations to secure my family's safety first, so a nation has obligations to secure the safety of its own citizens, but it still has obligations to help other nations, other citizens as well. So I think you could definitely ding Trump on some of his draconian immigration policies. His rhetoric was often exceedingly unhelpful, bombastic, idiotic, and inarticulate. That I think really people liked him because he jabbed at other people that they thought were wrong, or that kind of bullied them a lot. But my biggest issue with Trump is he just couldn't articulate the arguments, right?
Yeah.
So he just relied too much on rhetoric and just getting people into a fever. You want somebody who can really articulate the positions, and he just couldn't. So yeah, his rhetoric, of course, and I think this is something that people have consistently pointed out with Trump. And I just don't think in many issues that he was even pro-life enough. He wanted to make exceptions on the pro-life thing. He didn't push it hard enough. So I do criticize him he's still probably the best pro-life president, certainly in my lifetime, that I've seen. But he could and should have gone much further with that. He also should have done much more, far more early on, to protect freedom of speech, fight against censorship, and break up the big tech conglomerate. That was a huge failure of Trump, and it might actually be what ultimately done him in at the end. to not do that. I mean, there were early warning signs, major issues with this very early on. People were calling on him, hey, you've got to step up. And it's not just with big tech, but at college campuses, this whole horrible assault on freedom of speech, if you at all dissent from the mainstream sort of liberal narrative, is very frightening. And Trump really did not do enough to fight back against that. And that was a huge failure of Trump. That's something that I think is a very legit criticism that you can have of him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he foresaw that there would be a lot of fraud in the election, like with the mail-in ballots, but he didn't really do anything to prevent it. Like, right. And so he tried retroactively to like fix, go through the courts and everything, but like, surely there was more he could have done to prepare for that. Like, if he was really afraid of a fraudulent election, then, well, you're the president. Like, you
right.
can do something.
Bill Barr, said it really well before. He says, like, look, there's enough tensions and heat already going into this election. Like, imagine that it's a big sporting event, right? And you're just very tense about the outcomes. The last thing you want to do is change the rules of the game right before the game is played, right? Because regardless of what happens, that just casts doubt on the whole legitimacy, right? It just seems really fishy and makes people really suspicious. And of course, there's been a lot done research-wise on why you shouldn't have mail-in voting, because it is, of course, widely susceptible to fraud. But even putting that aside, just changing the rules of the game, the procedures right before what was arguably the most contentious election, certainly again in my lifetime.
Yeah,
just seems like an horrible thing to do. And I think you're right. The fact that Trump didn't fight more against it. And again, I'm not sure exactly what was all in his power to do at that point, but it seemed, I'm with you. It seems like he probably could and should have done more. And all conservatives, Republicans should and could have done more on that. So so all that's to say is what I wish people would do. And this is something that I often try to remind myself of, is that we have to just, if we're evaluating political candidates, it can't just be, well, I'm a Republican and they're a Democrat, therefore everything they do is wrong, or vice versa. It has to be issue by issue, policy by policy.
Yeah,
that's the only fair way to do it.
Which is hard because these candidates run on a platform or align themselves with the party. So it's kind of like if you vote for a certain candidate, you get like the grouping of policies as well. Like it's kind of like you can't separate them out too much. But yeah, when evaluating, we need to be very focused on that. I think the litmus test, like we've talked about before, is abortion. Like if someone supports abortion in any way, like I don't trust you on any policy. I don't even care. I don't even care what you think about immigration or the economy, because you believe in killing innocent life. So how am I expecting you to protect my guilty self?
Right. We've talked about this before, where if these other rights to economic prosperity, if you can call that a right, or healthcare or property or privacy, to the extent that they have any type of, binding legitimate force, it's only because they are extending from or deriving their legitimacy from human dignity itself,
right? Which
entails the most fundamental right, the bottom level right of the right to life. Yeah. So if you're not first absolutely securing that right for all citizens, from womb to tomb, as we say, it's hard to take you seriously on rights talk of any other sort, because you just don't even have a clear idea of the natural hierarchy that is involved in rights, in natural rights, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. And the other thing that you brought up is, you're right, and this is unfortunate, is sometimes you get this sort of package deal policies with these parties. In fact, it's exactly what you get. If you become, endorse a certain Democrat, you kind of know the policies in advance that they're going to promote, and that is deeply unfortunate, because like, why should your stance on, say, universal health care automatically determine your stance on abortion? It shouldn't, right? Like, these are things you should think about independently, right? Like, you should think through the question of universal health care and say, okay, is this legitimate? Can we make a moral claim that this is a right? That's one question. Then is this something that is practically achievable And if it is, would it be better than the system we have now? So lots of considerations there, and they're all fine and important things to consider. But what is the immediate link to that? That you would automatically just assume, yes, because I'm for universal health care and it aligns with this Democratic Party, therefore I should automatically assume their position on abortion. That makes no sense.
Right.
Right? It makes no sense whatsoever. And I would argue you could be for universal health care, but you should never be for abortion. Right? Ever. So that's kind of the issue with the sort of tribalistic partisan politics in America is oftentimes people have their one kind of pet issue. And it might be a very important issue. Sometimes it might not be the most important issue. We would argue that, of course, abortion is a preeminent issue because of how much it strikes at the most fundamental right that we have, that it does and should take precedence. But sometimes people will care, say, about tax policy or health care, and they'll say, I like what the Democrats say about this, and then they'll just adopt everything else that comes with the Democratic Party completely uncritically. Right. And that's intellectually lazy, and I think it's stupid. And same thing, even though I care deeply about the abortion issue, there's other things with the mainstream, just kind of American Republican positions that I disagree with, that I don't take on board. But I would argue that I would still vote for the person who's ardently and strongly pro-life, because my intention is, of course, to secure that most fundamental right, even if I don't agree with some of their other positions, right? And that gets into doctrine of double effect reasoning and stuff like that, right? So if I had a request for anybody who's listening, is just, you have to think through issues independently, right? There's no reason that you should just uncritically assume whatever the party's policy is on everything just because you like where they stand on one particular issue, right?
Yeah. I think another important thing to consider as we're about to launch into this conversation about the left and their strategies and stuff, it's one thing to talk about like the policies, and also it's another thing to defame a person. Now, but you can also speak out against someone who's doing evil things and say that's an evil person. It's okay to say that. My defense is that Jesus himself, when confronted about like, hey, don't you know Herod, that governor? He wants to kill you. And Jesus' response was tell that fox that I'm going to be here and here, and then tomorrow I'll go to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. He had no kind words for Herod. Like, it was like, no, he's a fox. Like, that's the truth. Like, this is a guy who's doing evil things. That being said, there's a radical sort of honor and submission that's given to those in authority by Christians. Like, for instance, in 1 Peter, it says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then later on he says, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. And you have to keep in mind that the emperors at this time were no friends of Christians. Mm-hmm. They were killing Christians. Honor the emperor. And that doesn't mean you do everything he tells you if it goes against the moral law by any means. But what it does mean is you keep boldly preaching the gospel. And if the law of the land is that you don't do that, you submit to the punishment that's coming your way and offer that up in union with Christ's suffering for the salvation of the world. But you keep preaching. You're not afraid of the results of that. And then also one last thought too before we dive in is, Joe Biden is the president, and even though we disagree vehemently with a lot of his actions and a lot of his policies, and really have a hard time respecting him as a person because he seems to, like we've mentioned before, kind of take the current of whatever's going on and just align himself with that. But he needs our prayers. He needs our prayers that he would repent and come to know Jesus and to actually be Catholic, not just say he's Catholic, but actually be Catholic. Mm-hmm. That would be an amazing thing. Like, imagine. And if God can do that for St. Paul, this guy who's murdering Christians, he can do that for Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And this is what it says in 1 Timothy. first of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, godly and respectful in every way.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not just complaining about these things. We're also like, hey, one of the best weapons we have as Christians is prayer. Let's pray for the leadership's conversions. No one is immune to God's grace. Like, everyone can convert. Like, it's possible. And but by bringing these things to light, what that does for us, Pat, is it gives us a greater urgency for the need for conversion. If we just pretended everything was okay and that what they're doing is fine, then we probably won't pray as hard.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, look, hard times, suffering, persecution, there can and often is great spiritual fruit in that, not just for ourselves, but for our society at large. So, we have to hold on, and we always need to hold on and should hold on to that Christian optimism and hope. And you make good points and to a degree, I am going to hold Biden to a higher standard than Trump, precisely because Biden, frequently talks about how he is, quote unquote, a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
And that
as brothers, we need to rebuke him. Like,
right.
I mean, and say, hey, you're not being Catholic right now. You're supporting abortion, which is intrinsically evil and totally against church teaching in every way.
And he says, like he accepts church rule privately, but not publicly. And like, what on earth could that even mean?
And that's against church teaching.
That is against church. Like, there's no good way out of this for Joe Biden, right? Because either he believes what the church teaches is true, or he doesn't. If he believes that it's true, especially church teaching on human dignity and the grave immorality of abortion, then what principled reason could he have for not wanting to secure the fundamental right to life for everybody in society? And it's not like what principled reason could he possibly have to not do that if he really believes what the church teaches on this? The answer is none whatsoever, except for his own personal political gain and power, right? And it's not like he needs to thump the Catholic catechism at his political rallies. The pro-life position just is the right position, given good philosophy and all the relevant scientific facts, right? You don't need to make the argument religiously. There's certainly church authority supports it, but you can make the pro-life position decisively just through philosophy and science. That's it, right? Nor does he need to become a Republican. It would be wonderful to see pro-life Democrats again, even though they've essentially been shunned from the party, which is incredibly depressing, right? On the other hand, if he doesn't believe what the church teaches is true, then he's a phony and an imposter, right? So either he's just supremely ignorant, or he's just intentionally misleading and malicious, and either of those are just terrible options, right?
You can't be ignorant when many bishops, not all bishops, unfortunately, but many bishops are refusing him communion because he's a public figure.
And if he says he accepts church rule personally, then he knows church rule, right? Well, but he can't know it that well, because he would know that isn't an option if you know church rule. So it's just like the things that come out of his mouth are so incoherent. Say whatever you want about Trump's stupid statements. The only difference is like just Trump kind of sounds inarticulate when he's being inarticulate. Biden just sounds polished when he's being stupid, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to get that out there, because, and it's true, I will be holding Biden to a higher standard precisely because he talks about being a devout Catholic, whereas Trump, again, pray for his conversion always, but he wasn't coming in as a Catholic president.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what I'm excited about for this conversation, though, is it goes way beyond Trump and Biden. These are just two representatives of respective ideologies or parties, you could say. And so even if Biden wasn't the president, let's say Kamala Harris was, or, another Democrat was a president. It's like, we're talking now about like this overarching ideology, this method of the left, which is not even bound to political party. It's also in our culture, and in these big tech companies, and like what's going on with like, what is this strategy that's overarching that Biden is simply the representative today, but he's not going to be in for very long. But like there still is this ideology, this thing that's like pushing forward, and there's a certain strategy that's going on with this. And so that's what I'm excited for you to unpack for us, Pat, is because Biden will come and he will go, but this thing, this principality, or what you could say, is still marching forward, and we need to know how to stop it and how to be aware of it.
Right. Yeah. So we were chatting, I guess, the other day when this came up of how we both noticed this, that a lot of how the left advances is they promote something that is, flagrantly false, that is a lie, that has no real basis in reality, but they push it long enough to get their sort of narrative through that by the time the truth comes out, people are distracted enough by another issue, it almost doesn't matter. Right. And this has been done in their agendas, I would say, for same-sex marriage, for transgenderism, certainly for a lot of smearing of Trump supporters as bigots or fascists, for COVID lockdowns, for hydroxychloroquine. So like maybe we'll just go through a number of examples just to show what I mean. So let's start with one that really, really kind of ticked me off, and I think should tick everyone off. And I call it the curious case of Covington High. You remember this one, Eric?
The Covington boys?
Right, the Covington boys.
Yes.
And I think this should give everybody great pause about how the left operates, especially the left in conjunction with the mainstream media and the tech conglomerates. Now, if you weren't familiar with this, what happened was a clip was taken at the March for Life of young high school kids from Covington High wearing Trump hats, right?
When was this again? What year?
I think, was this been last year or the year before?
Yeah, it was pretty recent, like 2018 or 2019.
Yeah, it was under the Trump administration, right? Yeah. And what happened is the clip came out, and there was this Indian man named Nathan Phillips who was kind of banging a drum, and this young kid with a Trump hat kind of sitting there like smiling at him. That it could have looked like the kid was bullying this guy, or kind of like trying to intimidate him or something like this, right? So this whole narrative gets spun, right? That these racist, bigoted, bully Trump supporters at the March for Life. So it wasn't just trying to like tear down Trump supporters, it was trying to tear down the March for Life too. Of just look how intolerant and horrible they were. Like really just slandered this kid, this entire high school. Everybody was throwing them under the bus, including, very unfortunately, certain Catholic bishops as well.
Yeah.
Just immediately. Well, what happens is eventually the full clips come out, and you get full like hour to 2 hours of footage of what actually went on. And what we learn, and if people haven't watched this, Google The Curious Case of Covington High Chronicles of Strength. You can go right to my website. I linked the full clips. I didn't even really comment because there's no comment necessary. Just watch and you'll see for yourself that the narrative was completely false. In fact, it wasn't just false. It was pretty much the opposite of what happened. The boys were standing there entirely peacefully. They were being agitated by this group known as the Black Hebrew Israelites, who were saying the most grotesque, vile, and racist things that you have ever heard in your life towards many of these kids and other people there. Such vile things, I won't even dare to repeat them. You'll have to watch the clips. And this Nathan Phillips guy, who is known to be an agitator, he came up and he was the one that approached the boys and was agitating them. And the kid was just smiling there kind of nervously. He wasn't going up to this guy or anything even close to it. So not only was the narrative completely false, but it was, again, almost essentially the exact opposite of how the left and the mainstream media portrayed it. The racists were not the boys. It was this other group. The agitators were not the boys. It was this Nathan Phillips guy. But what mattered? What became of that? Well, once the truth finally came out, the damage was already done, right? This poor kid's name was already slandered. And, Trump supporters, young Trump supporters were already, deemed, look how horrible they are, especially these March for Life people. So it wasn't just Trump supporters, but March for Life. Look how, bigoted they are and this or that. And it just wasn't true. It was a complete lie. And it's hard to see how it wasn't an intentional lie, right? Because whoever released those initial clips probably had the fuller scene, the fuller picture, and they decided to spin it in an intentionally misrepresentative way, which is an evil, evil thing. Now, fortunately, there has been some restitution because this kid, the primary kid, Nicholas Salmon, sued these outlets and received significant restitution, from my understanding. But the cultural damage was done and the narrative was advanced. So, in a sense, it's just too little, too late, right?
And that's the thing, is that they spun this whole thing. Everyone freaked out, called him racist, and then people still called Trump supporters racist because of this, even though it was proven the opposite, but it didn't matter because the narrative had already taken hold.
Right.
And that's the strategy.
Yeah. So that's just one example. People might say that's a mild example, but it's a common example of how this works. So that's a stage setter. Let's take another interesting one of hydroxychloroquine, right? Because this was something that was suggested that might help with people who catch COVID, and people were unsure at first, and then Trump started touting it, and then as soon as Trump touted it, everybody said that he's an insane, unscientific person, and that it's reckless and dangerous for him to promote something like this, and then. Then it just kind of completely fell away, right? Even though there were many other medical people saying, actually, Trump might be onto something here, and we shouldn't dismiss something just because Trump endorses it, right? Well, as it turns out, Trump, though he was inarticulate, wasn't actually wrong, and the mainstream narrative of this was wrong. So I have in front of me a systematic review that was published in November of 2020. And the title is, and we can link all these resources in the show notes, called Hydroxychloroquine is Effective and Consistently So When Provided Early for COVID-19, a Systematic Review. Now I'll just read a little bit of the abstract here, just to give people an idea. Hydroxychloroquine has shown efficacy against coronavirus disease in some but not all studies. We hypothesized that a systematic review would show hydroxychloroquine to be effective against COVID-19, more effective when provided earlier, not associated with worsening disease, and safe. We searched PubMed, Cochrane, Embase, Google Scholar, and Google for all reports on hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19 patients. We examined the studies for efficacy, time of administration, and safety. Hydroxychloroquine was found to be consistently effective against COVID-19 when provided early in the outpatient setting. It was also found to be overall effective in inpatient studies. No unbiased study found worse outcomes with HCQ use. No mortality or serious safety adverse events were found. HCQ is consistently effective against COVID-19 when provided early in the outpatient setting. It is overall effective against COVID-19. It has not produced worsening of disease, and it is safe. Now, why is that important? It seems kind of a minor thing, and this is, but it's hugely important because it shows that the mainstream left was willing to forgo what now seems to be an effective and safe treatment for people who catch COVID, and hinder people's health just because they couldn't bear the idea that Trump might have said something that could be right or could be worth looking into. And that's just utterly deranged and diabolical as far as I'm concerned. Now, I have no dog in the hydroxychloroquine fight. Like, I don't care if it works or not, but I do care about knowing the truth of whether it works or not. And there's something really sinister and really frightening about a political agenda that will overlook treatments for people's health, coronavirus or otherwise, just because they are intent on subverting a particular political candidate. So they lied. They lied about this, or at least they grossly over-exaggerated what they were saying, went far beyond what the scientific basis was at the time when they were completely damning this potential treatment, rather than saying, well, maybe maybe we're just not sure, right? At most they could have said, we're not sure yet, but we should research it further. No, they went way further than that. And now look, and now look, like, but again, the damage is done. Right now, it doesn't matter. So the point is, so much of this leftist strategy is they push a lie, and they bank on the truth, because it's always easier to put a lie out there, right? It takes almost no effort, and especially if you have a bunch of people that can all get, in the sort of left-wing media complex, push it simultaneously. That by the time that people do research, and because look, it's always much more difficult, much more arduous to get to the truth of something than it is to promote a lie. Always. So people who are after truth are always going to be just mechanically disadvantaged, because it's just harder to figure out truth than it is to promote a lie. That by the time the truth starts coming out, with like this study published in November, like we're so far past that conversation now, it doesn't matter, right? It just doesn't matter. And it's not like any of these mainstream media outlets are talking about this recent systematic review.
And
right?
They got what they wanted. They shamed and made Trump look like a terrible liar and
idiot,
anti-scientific, right? And that perhaps helped Biden get elected. And so they got the result they wanted by using an evil means, namely lying and slander. I think what's ironic, Pat, though, is that on the other side of things, there was a lot of accusations about Trump lying and like putting things out there, and then the media having to uncover the truth. And so I wonder if it does go both ways. I mean, I'd have to look at examples of that, but at least in these examples, it seems like there really is a systematic thing that the mainstream media is doing.
Right. Well, first, I think the fair person has to say you have to take a case by case. So I'm not going to dismiss out of hand that might be the case. Trump has been known to grossly exaggerate many things. I think he's often directionally accurate, but just not very precise, if that makes sense. And other times he is just wrong. But the thing about the mainstream media, which is pretty much synonymous with the left-wing political agenda these days, is that they're so consistently wrong on the things that I'm very sure about, like abortion, right? For example, they're so consistently wrong on abortion, ethically, certainly ethically, but also scientifically, the way they present it. And so again, are they that ignorant, or are they just lying about it? And if they're so consistently wrong about big things that I know they're wrong about, why should I trust them on things that I don't know about?
Yeah.
Right. People should think about that, right? Like if some, outlet is wrong on 3 big issues that you really know very well, right? And that they're consistently wrong about that. It seems like they might even be intentionally wrong about those things. At what point should they lose credibility on everything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly where that point is. But it seems to me that the mainstream media has struck out enough times on things that I do know enough about that there's no reason that I'm just going to, on the surface, take them at their word on virtually anything at this point.
And it's so funny when people are like, well, where'd you get that source from? And people say maybe like Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, like one of the mainstream media. And it's like, are they trustworthy though? Like, is that a trustworthy news outlet? Or maybe they'll demolish someone that says like, oh, I got it from the Epoch Times, or I got it from this really small mom and pop venue for news outlet, or so. I don't know what an example would be. And they instantly are like, well, that's not credible. It's like, well, wait, is the mainstream media, is that credible? Like, so it's an interesting thing to think about, because now there's a serious trust issue in America.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think enough people do not trust the mainstream media to where it's like, well, then where do we turn to get accurate information? That's one thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so who do we trust? And if we can't trust anyone, how do we function? Like, how do we know what is true when all these narratives are being spun from different angles? Whether it's Fox News spinning it a certain way and then CNN spinning it the opposite way.
Right.
It's like playing the same game, but on different ends of the spectrum.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. First off, I wouldn't trust any mainstream news outlet as my primary source of trying to figure out what's true and good in the world. And certainly we see Fox News laughed at and dismissed very much. I don't watch Fox News, but I'll tell you what, I'm much more terrified and frightened about the lies that the mainstream left-wing media puts out than I am about Fox News.
And what's crazy too is that, like with CNN and MSNBC, enough people apparently still do trust them, that it works. Like, like
a lot of people still do, right?
And that's pretty crazy.
So let's keep going down the list here because we're
Yes,
kind of
yes,
just
yes.
getting warmed up. Here's another big one: COVID lockdowns, right?
Yes.
My gosh, how anti-scientific and misleading could the left be, right? I mean, we heard so much of the criticism about Trump that it's all Trump's fault, right? Of the coronavirus catastrophe. That if he would have just locked down harder sooner, then none of this would have happened. And we've had this, we started first off, we had this incredible moving of the goalposts throughout, right? Because initially, like, we were supposed to have lockdowns to just, make sure the healthcare systems didn't go overwhelmed, to flatten the curve was what we were sold on. And we're still undergoing many of these draconian lockdown policies in many states, right? Like really crazy lockdown policies. And they were promoted to us as, this is what we need to do to battle the coronavirus, right? Well, as it turns out, this is just absolutely false, right? So, I mean, it's ridiculously, patently false, and demonstrably false. So I'll just go through a couple quick examples. There was a study published very recently on assessing mandatory stay-at-home and business closure effects on the spread of COVID-19. This came out just January 5th of 2021. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, I think he's at Stanford, was one of the researchers here, and the results said that implementing any NPIs, so NPIs would be non-pharmaceutical interventions, implementing any NPIs was associated with significant reductions in case growth. Reading the wrong paragraph. Here we go. While small benefits cannot be excluded, we do not find significant benefits on case growth of more restrictive NPI, specifically lockdowns. Similar reductions in case growth may be achievable with less restrictive interventions. Now, that's about the nicest study I've read about lockdowns and stuff like this. So lockdowns make no meaningful difference at all. They just cause harm. And I'll reference three other studies, right? So it's in Fox News, right? The Lancet, right, has a study on this. They're a pretty prestigious journal, if people are familiar with that. And they found that, quote, government actions such as border closures, full lockdowns, and a high rate of COVID-19 testing were not associated with statistically significant reductions in the number of critical cases or overall mortality. That's from The Lancet. Frontiers in Public Health, another published study, quoting, stringency of the measures settled to fight a pandemia, including lockdown, did not appear to be linked with death rate. Tel Aviv University had a study. We would have expected to see fewer COVID-19 fatalities in countries with a tighter lockdown, but their data reveals that this is not the case. So lockdowns don't work. They don't work. They cause harm and they don't save lives, right? And trying to blame Trump for all the, which is ridiculous, right? Trump's the president, but like we have a federal system for a reason, right? Like governors have responsibilities, state legislators have responsibility. Like you can't just blame everything on the president all the time. And this works both ways, right? Like if something's going on that we don't like, that clearly isn't or won't be Joe Biden's fault in the future, I hope we don't point directly to Joe Biden if it clearly isn't his fault. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But this was another thing that was promoted, that the mainstream media promoted, that we need to do it. Right. We need to do these lockdowns. This is the patriotic thing to do. It caused enormous damage that we still haven't even been able to calculate. And we're not even sure how it's all going to bear out in the future.
And who's unscientific now?
There's tons of models and estimates, and they're all terrible of the long-term effects of this.
Well, the CDC came out, right, and said that they did a study on that people from the age of 18 to 24, 1 in every 4 of them have now contemplated suicide in the year 2020, or during the specific months of like lockdown.
Right.
Okay,
right.
That can't be healthy. So yeah, you may, yeah. And obviously it's not
Well,
even effective.
I'll give you more. So
Yeah.
Bhattacharya, he's part of the, another, there are a lot of great relevant medical doctors who've spoken out about lockdowns, but for some reason they don't get highlighted by the mainstream media. But they've been talking about the collateral damage of COVID lockdown policies on suppressed medical and cancer screenings, inflation in acute cardiovascular deaths, mental health distress, what you're talking about, but especially among the elderly, increased relapse risk, alcohol abuse, domestic abuse. I mean, the list just goes on, right? And the fact that this is never even discussed is horrendous, right? Because if there's anything else we should know about public policy, it's that you can't be completely myopic. You can't just focus on just one thing and focusing all your attention, energy, and resources on one thing without considering how that isn't going to have a ripple effect throughout other sectors of society at large. That's hugely idiotic and irresponsible. So without even admitting other considerations, we have, again, a huge issue of negligence on the mainstream media and the left. But we were just sold something that never had a scientific basis as science. And as the science continues to come out on it, it's not admitted, it's not acknowledged, but the damage has already been done. The narrative has been pushed through, and it probably served its purpose. If we're just being honest, and again, I don't have a study to confirm this, but you can't help but wonder if a lot of this was just a way to just increase distress and dissatisfaction to get Trump out, right?
Yeah.
That's not a completely implausible hypothesis, especially
and to take away our freedoms and control us. I mean, not to mention, now the government, okay, we've shown that they can just snap their fingers and all restaurants go out of business, basically.
It's just it's such a horrendous evil, because it's so important to understand that those who impose burdens have the burden of proof. Now, government does have the authority to make certain moves and suppress certain rights for the common good in cases of emergency. But as so I think probably when we were super uncertain, maybe you could have made a case for those initial, lockdowns for the 15 days, right? I say probably only because we already had, an overwhelming consensus prior to the COVID situation that lockdowns weren't effective. And somehow this consensus started to be overturned. So, but whatever, put that aside. What certainly isn't justified is going long beyond that, especially after seeing the data come in that these aren't making a meaningful difference, and continuing to ruin people's lives, enact all these, other enormous tolls, and then continue to act like this is some type of scientific thing when it just isn't. It just isn't at all, right? So I just mentioned 3 studies that completely refute the idea that lockdowns have not only any scientific basis for their effectiveness, but show that they're not effective. And why? But again, the damage is already done. The narrative has been pushed through. So what difference is it going to make, right?
Yeah, and just to take a brief step back as to why would they want to do this? And there's a book out there, I don't know if you've read it, Pat, called Rules for Radicals by Saul
I have
Alinsky.
heard of it, yeah.
I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a book that talked about this, and my own mother's read it because she wanted to, because basically this is President Obama, this was his playbook, and Hillary Clinton, she did her thesis, I think, on Saul Alinsky's book, which he dedicated the book to Lucifer, by the way, the first rebel, which is a pretty big red flag.
Right.
Maybe he did it out of jest. I don't know. But either way, it is dedicated to Lucifer. But anyway, one of the big things in that book, apparently, is the ends do justify the means in that book. And so one of the strategies of usurping power is to just target someone, anyone, target an enemy, target someone, and just bash them. And let people ignore the issues. Just bash this person. And then you can do whatever you want. You can slander, you can lie, but you're going to bash that person, and then you're going to be taking power. Right, and that's one of the tactics of this Rules for Radicals. And that's exactly what we've seen played out in this last election or really the whole Trump presidency. And even before that with Obama bashing Bush and blaming everything on Bush.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it goes both ways. Like I'm not sure Trump was very friendly to Obama, and what he did. But I'm just saying, like, there's a reason why they were so focused on Trump. And if it's not Trump, it's going to be someone else. Because guess what? That distracts the masses from actually talking about the issues.
Of course.
And they can insert all these things that, hey, but at least it's not this guy, Right. And it's like, well, that's just rules for radical playbook, like being played out because they want to take power.
Yeah, if people think, I have a couple things to say for that, right? That the left will be any more decorous with anybody that isn't Trump. I mean, you don't know the left, right? They slandered and called all sorts of Republicans the worst, most vile names. Trump might have made it easier for them to do with like his tweets and stuff, but please, this is what the left does. So do not delude yourself to think that if you have somebody else that the left is ever going to elevate their behavior, because you're right, this is their playbook. And part of it stems from their deeper, poor ethical commitments of being largely utilitarian, right? Leftist ideology, kind of with its roots in, Marxism and liberalism is suffused with utilitarian ethical assumptions. So it doesn't matter if we lie. It doesn't matter if we say things that aren't true. It doesn't matter
as long as we get what we want.
We riot and burn and break laws, because at the end of the day, we'll get Trump gone and it's all worth it. And that is an evil, evil thing. And nobody can justify that. And certainly no conservative could justify that either. Mm-hmm. But hopefully conservatives aren't utilitarians. So we certainly don't and shouldn't follow that type of playbook.
Yes.
But yeah. All right. So let's just do two others. We'll just be quick here. Remember the gay gene? This was
the gay gene,
right? So this was interesting because so much of, the sort of agenda for same-sex marriage, and I think we've talked about that before, so we won't spend a whole bunch of time on that particular. There was a lot of bait and switch and falsity in that narrative. A lot of bait and switch and falsity, right? But one was the idea that, there's this gay gene, right? So you can't help but being gay. So it's
genetic.
It's genetic, right? So it's wrong to discriminate or not allow gay people to get married or whatever. Now, the first thing is that we need to acknowledge is that even if that were true, it's irrelevant, right? Because we could admit that people have certain dispositions, maybe even deep genetic dispositions to certain behaviors. But that doesn't mean that the behavior itself is ethical or acceptable. Like, for example, if somebody had a genetic disposition to be a child molester, we would say, no, we need to make sure that you don't molest children, right? Mm-hmm. Or if somebody had a genetic disposition to want to cut off all their own limbs, we'd say, no, you shouldn't do that, right? Because that's bad. That's objectively bad. So differentiating between having a disposition, whether it's genetic or whether it comes just through the environment that you're raised in or some mix of both, that doesn't mean that the behavior is morally acceptable, right? So that's the first bait and switch, right? Because certainly when it comes to the Catholic Church's teaching, we don't say that anybody who has same-sex attraction is a bad person. Clearly not, right? We all have things that we struggle with. We all have our crosses to carry in life. What we say is that it's the actions that are prohibited, that are immoral, right? So we all have inclinations to sinful behavior. What matters is, do we do our best to follow the moral rule in the situation that applies to us, or do we not? So that's the first bait and switch, is they just completely flip the conversation. And of course, the left being as ever dishonest as they are, that's why you would see on like CNN or this or that, like they would always find some like fundamentalist church that had a sign outside that said like God hates gay people to like, represent the religious view, which is just so fantastically false, right? Just never wanting to represent the best of the opposing side is another tactic of the left, right? They always want to pick out the actual idiots or actual bigots or stuff like that. We're never like an honest interlocutor on the other side. But anyways, forget all that. They push so much of the narrative through, not just through the bait and switch, but through this idea of a gay gene. But as it turns out, there is no gay gene, right? It's totally false. And there was Nature, one of the, premier scientific journals, and we'll link this in the show notes, has an article precisely on this, and it came out in August 2019, and it says no gay gene massive study homes in on genetic basis of human sexuality. Nearly 500,000 genomes reveal 5 DNA markers associated with sexual behavior, but none with the power to predict the sexuality of an individual. So as it turns out, the gay gene it's just false. It just doesn't exist, right?
And
so
that truth came out 4 years after
right
the deed was already done, where it was
Right.
legalized. Gay marriage was legalized in America in 2015.
right
But that didn't come out until 4 years after.
Right, and
there you go.
Is horrendously underreported. Virtually nobody even knows about this, and of course, it was attacked. Right, the lobbyists hated that they even published this thing. I have to give Nature credit for even keeping it up. I was surprised that they did. They put disclaimers on it saying this don't use this for hate or whatever nonsense that they have on there. But so two things to be said about this. Like, even if there was a gay gene, it'd be irrelevant to the greater debate for the reasons I just said, but there isn't. And so they pushed it through on this completely false, unscientific pseudo hypothesis that was later debunked, but it doesn't matter, right? Because they got what they wanted, right?
Yep.
The agenda was pushed through. So that's all right. Let me give one more example, because people are probably getting tired, even though I think you could go all day on this stuff. And that's transgenderism, and specifically gender reassignment surgery, right? So much of transgenderism was pushed through because, if you just let somebody who's struggling with gender confusion, have the reassignment surgery, then they'll be happier, right? Then their suicidal ideation will go down, and they won't be so depressed, they won't be so anxious, or anything of the sort, right? And people bought into it, and it got a ton of traction, and it turns out that it is completely false, right? So what happened is that I'll give a brief history, right? Is that in October 2019, the American Journal of Psychiatry published a paper titled "Reduction in Mental Health Treatment Utilizing Transgender Individuals After Gender-Affirming Surgeries," right? A total population study. And initially, the paper claimed that after sex reassignment surgeries, the patient was less likely to need mental health treatment. But as it happens, the editors of the journal and authors of the paper issued a correction on that. And to quote, they said the correction noted the results demonstrated no advantage of surgery in relation to subsequent mood or anxiety disorder related health care. And Ryan Anderson was really good. Ryan Anderson is a good Catholic, and he's got a great book out on the transgender issue called "When Harry Became Sally." I would recommend everybody read it, because this is the new cultural issue of our day. So I'm going to quote him now. He says, "It's actually worse than just a correction, because the original results already demonstrated no benefits to hormone transition. That part didn't need a correction. So the bottom line, the largest data set on sex reassignment procedures, both hormonal and surgical, reveals that such procedures do not bring the promised mental health benefits." And why is this significant? Because people are being fed a lie. People have a mental disorder, and we need to be compassionate and empathetic and sympathetic to them. But the last thing you want to do to somebody who's struggling with disorder is feed them a lie and tell them that they're going to have a medical treatment, which is really not a treatment at all, and that can completely disfigure them for the rest of their lives and have life-altering effects that who knows what terribleness that's going to bring down the line, whether it's just giving puberty blockers and hormonal treatments to kids, or full-on just mutilation that they call reassignment surgery. This is diabolical stuff, and it's being sold to young people, and it's based on a lie that's utterly abusive, utterly sinister, and it's all just being used to push this radical gender ideology. And it's just false. But does it matter now? Because now that this correction's out, it's already been so pushed. The gender ideology has already been pushed so forward. It's hard to see what difference this will make.
Man, and have like suicides even gone up from these people that have experienced the surgeries. I think I heard that actually once, but I don't have the article in front of me or anything.
I just feel
But
so terrible for anybody in that situation because it's like, people with any other type of disorder, anxiety, depression, things like that, because it's not tied to a political ideology, we can try to research effective treatments and just kind of be apolitical about it, hopefully, right? But with the gender stuff, it's so political that you can't really trust an objective evaluation of what's going on, and that's really sad, and I feel just terrible for anybody in that. And in fact, you can almost be assured that you're not going to get an objective evaluation, and that's terrible. I mean, that's a terrible, terrible thing. So I don't know of whether the suicides go up. I guess long term we'll see that probably they do, but even if not, we know that it doesn't help. Right. And that
Yeah.
itself is progress. To know that some treatment isn't actually an effective treatment is progress. Right. So we stop doing something to somebody that actually isn't helpful.
I think the disconcerting thing is that people don't really care much about the truth. I mean,
Right.
at the end of the day, they care about their agenda. They care about their
Mhm.
ideology being pushed forward. And when the truth does come out and it doesn't align with their agenda, they silence it, they ignore it. They do whatever they can to not let it see the light of day,
Right.
which is a
Mhm.
suppression on free speech, censorship. Like, we didn't even scratch that surface. But, this is all remind me of something in 2 Timothy. I think this is a really good verse for our times. It's very appropriate. 2 Timothy chapter 3, it says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of stress. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates, fierce, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding the form of religion but denying the power of it. Avoid such people, for among them are those who make their way into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and swayed by various impulses, who will listen to anybody and can never arrive at a knowledge of the truth. As Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth, men of corrupt mind and counterfeit faith. But they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men." I think we can rest assured in that the truth will come out, and at the end of the day, like, Christ is the judge, and he will come back, and everything will be exposed. In the meantime, it's very helpful to expose it already, like to expose the darkness and say, hey, and this, honestly, Pat, this is so helpful to me because, okay, we already have these concrete historical examples of very recent history that people listening, they can remember, like, oh, I remember that. So guess what? Next time a story gets rolled out, maybe be a little skeptical. Like, maybe don't just hook, line, and sinker buy into the narrative, because maybe there's actually an agenda that's being pushed forward, and the truth is probably far from that.
Right. You don't have to be cynical, but you should maintain a healthy skepticism. Absolutely. So I hope this has been helpful. We've highlighted just a few recent examples, but I think that this is the left's playbook: is lie, deny, and then distract. Right.
Yeah.
Consistently again. And then once they kind of get what they want, either in the form of authoritative power or legislation, they just distract. They move on to the next issue, and then it doesn't matter that a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10, however long, that when it comes out that, oh yeah, we bought that and that was just totally false. It doesn't matter. It's a sunk cost, right?
Yeah.
But it does matter, because here's the thing that conservatives learn: we don't have to keep just playing defense, right? The Overton window, or the window of acceptable conversation, right? We try to keep it where it is as conservatives, but the left keeps pushing it. We need to start pushing it back in the other direction. There's no reason that conservatives need to accept the current paradigms on these things. We need to start talking about, these horrible ideologies and how abusive they are, and why they need to be out of the public sphere, especially these promoting hormone and surgical procedures on children. It's grotesque. So we need to start pushing, not just playing defense, but playing offense, getting out there and pushing the culture back in the right direction is, I guess, the note I would want to end on. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And real quick too, I think it's important, just Pat, if you could define what we mean by the left and what this overarching ideology is in our final notes. We probably should have done that at the beginning, but just to be clear, like what we're talking about, I think people naturally know because there's so much talk about these things, but just to be clear.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I just kind of accept that the charitable listener will be able to identify who I'm talking about, right? Of course, if you're uncharitable, you're gonna say not all Democrats. Of course, not all Democrats, right? Most of my family, my grandparents were Democrats, and they were some of the most admirable people who respected human dignity in my life, and I love them. And one of the most disappointing things is to see how far the Democrat Party has moved away from the values of my grandparents, right? So yes, not all Democrats. I mean, the left is an ideology that is kind of committed to a number of either implicitly or implicitly, either consciously or unconsciously, a number of philosophical positions, nominalism, utilitarianism, often atheism, if not at least agnosticism, various forms of socialism, communism, right? So it's hard to kind of like really just totally define it, but these are the qualities that sort of set it off or mark it off, right? Those are definitely the big ones, right? Relativism is another one. Often reductionistic, mechanistic. They're anti-realist, in terms of there being natures in the world, which is very funny because they often talk about how scientific they are, but a lot of their philosophical presuppositions are totally not like, they don't even make science possible, right? Their relativism, their nominalism. It's hard to see how you even support science on your sort of world. And again, most people who are on the left don't even think about this, but I'm saying these are kind of the underlying philosophical currents that have seeped in and formed the progressive, kind of leftist ideology that we've been trying to battle against, whether or not they realize it or not. And that's why it's so important to study philosophy and the history of philosophy, to see how different kind of streams of thought have gotten us to the point that where we are progressively over time. So those are just kind of the common markers of the left that I think contribute to the types of behavior that we see. That does arise, as you've noted, Eric, out of a sort of utilitarian commitment to an ends justifying the means towards a sort of Marxist type of society, right? So that's probably as close as the definition I'm going to be able to put out there. I know great. It's not everybody who's liberal or every Democrat. Obviously, I don't mean that, and I'm not going to be able to convince anybody who is just looking to be uncharitable that isn't. But that's just obviously.
And right. I think one of the cool things that you just mentioned too, of like, hey everyone, like let's push back on this Overton window. Like let's push the window over here so we can actually get these other things that are, that being pushed on us. It's like, well, let's fight back. I think the most effective way, Pat, in my experience, is to fight back using is probably the wrong word, but relating to the emotional undertow and then being reasonable like through it. So basically what I mean is like, maybe someone's pushing this transgender ideology and they're promoting this because they have a sense of compassion on these people that have this mental health difficulty, right?
Right.
Okay, like, hey, I hear your compassion. That's a great thing, to have compassion for another person. Let's now look together, what would be the best thing for this person? And then we go into the evidence of that. But right. I think there's like, we can talk about feelings, like, and I think that's the hard part about this, is that there's this unsaid like presupposition that a lot of people on the left have, that they are loving and people that oppose them aren't.
Yeah.
And when we can say, hey, actually, it's precisely because we love someone who has same-sex attraction, which is why we believe this, because this is actually the best thing for them. And so let's talk about what real love really is.
Yeah.
And so some people will be reasonable and charitable and can speak like that. A lot of people, unfortunately, use those words, compassion, love, as a guise, and they really are just wolf in sheep's clothing. And there really is no dialoguing with them. And what we need to do is just expose the fact that they aren't loving, they aren't compassionate, they have this agenda to control, manipulate, and that's what we need to expose.
Right. And I don't think most people are like that, but I do think there are enough people that are like that, right? I think most people are just acting from an emotional level without really thinking it through, because they are generally compassionate but somewhat gullible. And I know that sounds rude, but that's the case. But part of it comes down from again, the deeper philosophical presuppositions, where people think, oh, if somebody's feelings are this way, then we should just give them what their feelings are. If they consent to something, well, then we just give them what they consent, thinking that the good of someone is based in fleeting emotions, feelings, or consent. But that's totally wrong, right? The good of somebody is based on human nature and what objectively causes human flourishing, given that we are rational, social, political animals, right? Who are teleologically ordered to certain ends, the highest end being God, but ordered to other good ends, right? And that we can become disordered from those proper ends. And that's why disorder is actually an appropriate language, right? Because it's teleological language. It means that there is something that we should be properly ordered to.
Yes.
And then it's, well, what is that? And if love is willing the good of the other, the good is being properly ordered to our proper end, then to love somebody is to will their proper ordering, right? That's the true good. And even if somebody is consenting to go away, like, people still get this in many obvious examples, right? If somebody consents to wanting to, drink and do drugs all the time to the point of developing huge addiction, we still say, no, that's bad. It doesn't matter about your feelings about that or your consent. You're doing something that is objectively bad for you, that is quite disordered, right? And that's why we, at some point, hopefully, as I've had to do, unfortunately, with close family members of mine, you stage an intervention. And you at some point you actually use coercion. Now, I'm not saying you should use coercion in all these cases, but there's legitimate cases where we think, okay, this person is so deep in the hole, right, that they can't get themselves out, and they're kicking and they're screaming, but because we love them and we know that this is so bad for them, what they want at this point just doesn't matter, right? We're taking them to the rehab facility. And people need to think about that, right? Because if it's just somebody's consent or what they're willing or their feelings at the time, then why do we think that it's a good, loving thing to intervene with somebody who's really, deep in the holes of addiction or alcohol abuse or like that? So the point I'm bringing out is to emphasize what you're saying, right? What is good for somebody is grounded in what perfects human nature. Human nature has set ends, right? And we can either attain those ends or we can steer ourselves away from those ends. We can either be properly ordered or disordered, right? And some ends are proximate, they're related to our animal nature. Other ends are related to our rational nature, and some ends are natural. Other ends are supernatural, right? And when we talk about loving somebody, it's about willing their good as a human being and trying to get them to flourish as a human being. And that means trying to sit down and have an honest discussion about what that actually means. Because if that's true, then the compassionate thing isn't just what anybody feels at the time or is willing to consent to, but grounded in what is their actual objective good as a human being.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great way to end, and I think that's so important to keep in mind, that when we're exposing these things, it's precisely out of that love. We're willing the good of our listeners by saying, hey, this is something to be concerned about. This is a strategy of the left. And we want you to be aware so we can fight back and actually promote human flourishing and the dignity of every human life. And we also have to keep in mind that there are so many things that are at work here. Like, we know that our our war is not against flesh and blood, but it is against the principalities, the powers, the world rulers over the spiritual darkness, the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places, as Paul says in Ephesians. Like, there's a spiritual battle going on, which is why we need to pray. We need to have good dialogue. We need to fight back in the ways that we can, not using weapons that are of this world or weapons that are evil, but overcome evil by doing good, St. Paul tells us. And one of the best things we can do, and if you read the scriptures, they don't mince words with sin. Like, sin is sin. Jesus, just read Jesus' own words in the Gospels. He calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers, serpents, sons of the devil, because they were acting wickedly. And so we have to be bold in our love for each other. And it says in Proverbs that the rebukes of a friend are better than the kisses of an enemy. And I think that's something that I'm taking away from this too, is that, wow, like, don't shy away from rebuking the culture. If you really want to help the nation, if you really want to help the world, if you really want to help those affected by various issues, don't just cave into some ideology that in the end doesn't actually promote their good.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amen, brother. Good stuff.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Catch you later.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.